Hi, Lester, Wisher Engineer. I recently uploaded a video on a comparison between tactile and visual response times. In the video, I performed a series of tests on my own personal tactile and visual response times. I encourage you to go and watch that video first to get some context for this follow-up video. To sum up the results from those tests, they confirmed previous scientific research that indicated that human tactile response times were significantly better than visual response times. About 30% faster, in fact. I ended the video with an offer to produce a follow-up video looking at the overarching principles behind traditional martial arts approach to training human response times. And one of my viewers took me up on the offer and requested this. So here it is. Thanks for the comments, I do appreciate them. So briefly, there are three main types of martial arts response time training: physical, mental, and internal. Physical training is a pretty obvious pick and is what many people assume constitutes 100% of response training in martial arts. However, as I will explain, this is only a small part of the picture. When I mention martial arts and response training to a normie, they will typically picture something like this. Or this. Or maybe this. If I mention response training to a martial artist or combat athlete, they may picture speedball training, fast-moving bag work, fast-paced partner sparring, and exercises of the like. What all of these approaches have in common is that they are all physical training techniques. Physical training is definitely important for the development of fast responses. As mentioned in my previous video, scientific studies have shown that sedentary people have slower response times than physically active people. So if you want to have faster response times, you need to be engaged in some form of structured physical exercise. Most physical training requires fast responses. Think of ball sports as an example. Even running or working out at the gym do place one into situations in which fast responses are required, thus stimulating their development. Think of minute adjustments to foot placement that are required to respond to uneven ground while running. Or consider getting the timing right for a weightlifting movement or calisthenic exercise. All these movements have a heightened attendant response demand than sedentary activities, and thus place a demand on the brain and body, stimulating the development of faster responses. It's no stretch of the imagination to believe that when response times are trained specifically and systematically using certain specific physical martial arts training protocols, that the results of this training in terms of improvements to response time would be amplified when compared to other physical training that does not target response time directly. Some examples of the kind of physical training that martial artists use to train response times directly include such things as sensitivity training, blindfold training, chisao or sticky hands, sparring, including things like bag work, various reactions, speedball training, etc. Any kind of randomized, time-based response drills, such as punching a pressure sensor after a light, buzzer, or tactile signal is sent to you, can be used to test and train these responses physically. Working with a partner in some form of action response move can also test and train physical responses. One very powerful way to improve response times is through repetition of the desired movements in order to facilitate a more optimized response, either individually, as a group, or as an interaction between two or more people practicing combat movements. Note that the movements do not even have to be practiced rapidly in order to benefit from the repetition. such as in Tai Chi practice, for instance, as long as the practitioner does occasionally train at full combat speed to enable them to make the transition. This is part of the rationale behind the systematic repetition of techniques, forms, katas, and movements that's so iconic to traditional martial arts practice. However, there is more to this type of repetitive training than purely physical response time improvement. In fact, physical training alone can only go so far towards enhancing response times, because a significant part of the human response involves mental processing. So how do we make our brains faster at responding to signals? Well, I'm going to use two illustrations to demonstrate why an untrained mind is slower than a trained mind. The untrained mind is a bit like a smartphone that has had every junk app imaginable downloaded onto it, including all those sugared Candy Crunch and flashing jewel sequencing games, and most of them are all active and running at the same time. Even with a fast processing speed, the machine is so busy running all the junk apps that very little processing power is available to do anything else. Its overall processing speed is thus very low. In order to get the machine running faster, one would have to either shut down the apps or remove them from the phone. Once the phone has been stripped down to the bare operating system and only the most essential apps have been installed, its processing speed will be significantly higher. This is what traditional martial artists do to the apps running in their minds, using mental control techniques. Coming back to the idea of repetition of movements that I mentioned when I was talking about physical response training, Master Chen Chen Ho, who was the head of our system of traditional Chang Hong, Wushu, and Kung Fu, quotes an old martial arts proverb in his book Key to Hong Chuan: to box as if you are walking. He explains further, that is to say that every move has to be natural. The same thing goes for sparring and self-defense training. When one encounters a situation, first hold the breath steady and relax the body. If the body is tense, the heartbeat accelerates and one becomes nervous. This affects one's judgment, and one also tires easily. However, if one is relaxed, one can get rid of the bad habit of telegraphing one's moves, which is letting the opponent in on one's next move. When relaxed, one can also respond to external stimuli much faster. That is, be more responsive and sensitive to the opponent's body movements. I'd like to borrow an illustration that one of my students came up with to describe this. Instead of to box as if you are walking, we can also say to fight like you're driving a car. What do I mean by that? Well, not this. What I mean is that when you first start learning how to drive a car, you have to consciously think about every little detail while you're driving. You have to consciously think about changing gears, applying the brake, working the clutch, operating the steering wheel, watching for oncoming and following traffic, watching your speed, watching road signs and markings, reacting to hazards, and my personal favorite, parallel parking. There are a lot of actions and behaviors that make up safe driving. However, once you've been driving for a while, these actions and behaviors become instinctive, subconscious. You no longer have to consciously think about applying the brakes, working the clutch, or watching for hazards. You do this automatically while singing along with your favorite song on the radio. In fact, you don't even need to look at the gear lever, control pedals, indicators, steering wheel, or any of the other controls. You just know where they are. This is nothing less than a form of tactile sensitivity or proprioceptive conditioning, such as the kind that we try to develop in traditional wushu. If only a few people in the world could drive cars, it would be considered a circus act. There is so much skill represented there. But because it's so commonplace, no one even remarks about the small miracle of someone driving a car. Now, picture this unpleasant scenario. You're driving home from work and the lighting's poor. From seemingly out of nowhere, a crazy person sprints across the road right in front of you. Without thinking, you simultaneously and seamlessly perform several actions. These actions may include pumping the brakes, using the clutch, steering out of the way without turning too sharply in order to not roll the car, all the while watching for oncoming and following traffic. All of this in only a few seconds. And disaster is averted. Did you think consciously about your actions before performing them? No, you didn't. They were subconscious actions. If you'd had to think consciously about your actions, your reactions would more than likely have been too slow to avoid colliding with the crazy person. This is the kind of state that martial artists strive to be in when they are unfortunate enough to find themselves in a self-defense situation. All of our techniques, attacks, defenses, movements must be subconsciously applied. This special mental state is typically called the state of no mind. And I'd like to quote from Wikipedia now. The state of no mind is described by Wikipedia as follows. Mushin in Japanese and busin or wusin, excuse my pronunciation, I have very bad pronunciation, is in Chinese, is a mental state. Zen and Taoist meditators attempt to reach this state, as well as artists and trained martial artists. They also practice this mental state during everyday activities. The term contains the characters for negation, not or without, along with the character for heart-mind. The term is shortened from mushin no shin, a Zen expression meaning the mind without mind, and is also referred to as the state of no-mindedness. That is, a mind not fixed or occupied by thought or emotion, and thus open to everything. It is translated by D.T. Suzuki as being free from mind attachment. Mushin is achieved when a person's mind is free from thoughts of anger, fear, or ego during combat or everyday life. There is an absence of discursive thought and judgment, so the person is totally free to act and react towards an opponent without hesitation and without disturbance from such thoughts. At this point, a person relies not on what they think should be the next move, but what is their trained natural reaction or instinct, or what is felt intuitively. It's not a state of relaxed, near sleepfulness though. The mind could be said to be working at very high speed, but with no intention, plan, or direction. Some masters believe that mushin is the state where a person finally understands the uselessness of techniques and becomes truly free to move. In fact, those people will no longer even consider themselves as fighters, but merely living beings moving through space. The legendary Zen master Takuan Soho said, "The mind must always be in the state of flowing, for when it stops anywhere, that means the flow is interrupted, and it is this interruption that is injurious to the well-being of the mind. In the case of the swordsman, it means death. When the swordsman stands against his opponent, he is not to think of the opponent, nor of himself, nor of his enemy's sword movements. He just stands there with his sword, which, forgetful of all technique, is ready only to follow the dictates of the subconscious. The man has effaced himself as the wielder of the sword. When he strikes, it's not the man, but the sword in the hand of the man's subconscious that strikes." Forgetful of all technique, eh? Well, isn't that something? I really like this quote from Master Takuan Soho because it puts the concept of technique, the subject of so many pointless online arguments, and a hill that so many martial artists choose to die on these days, into perspective. I plan to do a dedicated video on this concept in future. Note that while a practitioner is in the state of no mind, they are not unconscious. Their conscious mind is still perfectly and fully engaged. However, their conscious mind does not overshadow or bully the input of the subconscious mind into subservience, as is typically the case in an untrained mind. Through discipline and training, the conscious mind adopts its proper place, not wasting time and resources processing rubbish. So the state of no mind, or Wu-Zin, could be described as a seamless unity of the conscious and subconscious mind. Combining this state of no mind with tactile responses, which are scientifically proven to be superior to visual responses, yields very fast responses indeed. In fact, there is much in the way of refinement that can be achieved with tactile responses through training. The following quote from Master Chen's article on Qigong training sheds some light on what practitioners should be trying to achieve. When facing an opponent and only using the eyes to observe their movements, the eyes send a signal to the cerebellum, which then gets the body to respond. This is often too slow. Intention development lets us easily feel the opponent's movements, as if our hand has consciousness and can detect through touch and can directly respond. Well, that all sounds very well and good, but how do we develop that? One of the training tools that we apply to train Wu-Zin is meditation. In our case, the meditation that we practice could be described as the systematic pursuit of Wu-Zin. In other words, the conscious application of discipline to quiet the many levels of spurious thought that are constantly blaring away like so many stereo systems being played at maximum volume at a dodgy campsite. Note that once a practitioner has achieved some level of proficiency in engaging Wu-Zin at will, it becomes possible to adopt this mindset while practicing techniques, performing forms or katas, and sparring. The more that this is practiced, the more likely that the practitioner will be able to engage this under pressure during life or death situations, bringing improved efficiency, speed, and processing power. For those of you who would like to develop this control, I encourage you to set a few minutes aside every day to practice stilling your mind. The last type of training for improving response times that I would like to discuss is internal training. Now, as far as internal training is concerned, scientific studies are very limited, so much of what I will discuss in this section is opinion, based on my personal experience and on what I feel I am doing in certain movements, until the necessary scientific studies have been undertaken to prove or disprove the hypotheses. The Wushu scientist and I have some very ambitious ideas about applying scientific research to internal training. In fact, one of these studies has already been successfully completed, and the Wushu scientist is currently completing the final draft of this study write-up as her sports science master's thesis manuscript. At this stage, I can say that the results of the testing and data analysis have done nothing but firmly support our original hypothesis about qi. Qi, or qi, is heavily associated with the production and control of fluid pressure in the body. We hypothesized that this pressure is produced and controlled from a series of intra-abdominal spaces in the body's core, and then communicated to the peripheral limbs through the rest of the fluid-filled cavities in the body within an organ known as the interstitium. This mechanism of pressure communication to amplify muscular action has, however, not yet been properly scientifically documented or studied. These pressure waves, pulses, or surges can amplify force production or the practitioner's ability to manipulate forces. In fact, there are many scientific papers that I will quote from in future videos that have found significant links between intramuscular fluid pressure and force production in the muscles, although in most cases the pressure is dealt with as a side effect of muscular tension. I need to interject, if I may. This is while I am actually editing the video prior to its release. Something has come up based on what I've just been saying in the video, which is that we've just become aware of a paper that was published early this year actually in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, which was published in January 21st of this year, 2020. And the title of the paper was Internal Fluid Pressure Influences Muscle Contractile Force. The paper was by D.A. Sloboda and T.J. Roberts. Now, I haven't even had a chance to properly read the paper yet because we haven't been able to download it yet via ResearchGate. But I've had a chance to have a look at the abstract and a couple of excerpts from the paper, and it is exceedingly interesting based on what I've just been saying in my video. And I'll share one quote from the paper, which goes like this. These findings show that pressurization can have immediate, significant effects on muscle contractile force and suggest that forces transmitted to the extracellular matrix via pressurized fluid may be important, but largely unacknowledged determinants of muscle performance in vivo. Now, this is very interesting and very much corroborates what I am saying in this video and in other videos that I've actually compiled on the topic of hydrostatic pressure related to chi and its effects on muscle contractile force. So very interesting. As I said, still early days. I've not read the paper fully myself yet, but definitely seems to corroborate what I'm saying. So I thought it was important enough to include at this late stage in the production of this video. Back to the video. I'll treat these subjects in more detail in another video. Today, all I will do is suggest that there is a link between pressure and muscular action. In addition, the areas traditionally associated with the production and control of chi in traditional martial arts, the centers or dantians, are located in particular intra-abdominal cavities that are capable of producing or modifying fluid pressure in the body. Internal martial artists train to marshal all movement from these centers. In our case, we reference the lower dantian a lot in our training, an area roughly in the center of the pelvic cavity. Once established and fine-tuned, this marshalling point ultimately allows the martial artist to strive towards perfect unity in their movement. In other words, every part of the body moving synergistically and in balance with every other part to achieve a united goal. This is a gross oversimplification for the purposes of this video. But using this central marshalling point yields another advantage as well. If all movement is marshaled and controlled from a central mechanical control point, the center or lower dantian, it becomes possible to generate faster responses because the prime mechanical impulse for movement is initiated from one point before spreading through the body like a wave. And this instead of the brain having to send multiple signals to the arms, legs, fingers, feet, etc., and then trying to coordinate and balance a number of separate mechanical subsystems. I believe there's a lot more to this than what I've explained here. To illustrate this, I will quote from the Wikipedia article on the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system, ENS, or intrinsic nervous system, is one of the main divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, and consists of a mesh-like system of neurons that governs the function of the gastrointestinal tract. It's capable of acting independently of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, although it may be influenced by them. The ENS is also called the second brain. It is derived from neural crest cells. The enteric nervous system is capable of operating independently of the brain and spinal cord, but does rely on innervation from the autonomic nervous system via the vagus nerve and the prevertebral ganglia in healthy subjects. However, studies have shown that the system is operable with a severed vagus nerve. The neurons of the enteric nervous system control the motor functions of the system, in addition to the secretion of gastrointestinal enzymes. These neurons communicate through many neurotransmitters transmitters similar to the CNS, including acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin. The large presence of serotonin and dopamine in the gut are key areas of research for neurogastroenterologists. The enteric nervous system in humans consists of some 500 million neurons, including the various types of Dugel cells. 0.5% of the number of neurons in the brain, 5 times as many as the 100 million neurons in the human spinal cord, and about 2/3 as many as in the whole nervous system of a cat. The enteric nervous system is embedded in the lining of the gastrointestinal system, beginning in the esophagus and extending down to the anus. Function. The ENS is capable of autonomous functions like the coordination of reflexes, although it receives considerable innervation from the autonomic nervous system. It can and does operate independently of the brain and spinal cord. Its study is the focus of neurogastroenterology. Complexity. The enteric nervous system has been described as a second brain for several reasons. The enteric nervous system can operate autonomously. It normally communicates with the central nervous system, or CNS, through the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. However, vertebrate studies show that when the vagus nerve is severed, the enteric nervous system continues to function. In vertebrates, the enteric nervous system includes efferent neurons, afferent neurons, and interneurons, all of which make the enteric nervous system capable of carrying reflexes and acting as an integrating center in the absence of CNS input. The sensory neurons report on mechanical and chemical conditions. Through intestinal muscles, the motor neurons control peristalsis and churning of intestinal contents. Other neurons control the secretion of enzymes. The enteric nervous system also makes use of more than 30 neurotransmitters, most of which are identical to the ones found in the CNS, such as acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin. More than 90% of the body's serotonin lies in the gut, as well as about 50% of the body's dopamine, which is currently being studied to further our understanding of its utility in the brain. The enteric nervous system has the capacity to alter its response, depending on such factors as bulk and nutrient composition. In addition, ENS contains support cells which are similar to the astroglia of the brain, and a diffusion barrier around the capillaries surrounding ganglia which is similar to the blood-brain barrier of cerebral blood vessels. Well, that's really interesting, because the enteric nervous system is located in the areas traditionally called centers, or the dantians, areas associated with qi generation and manipulation. I personally believe that the enteric nervous system, which is co-located with the traditional dantians, can in fact be consciously accessed and used to coordinate physical responses through the traditional martial arts training processes that essentially apply the principle of neuroplasticity to adapt and weaponize the enteric nervous system's original function. However, there's no research that I'm aware of on the connection between the conscious mind, subconscious mind, and the enteric nervous system. If you are aware of some legitimate scientific research on this topic, please share a link to the research. I'd be quite interested. For those of you who would like to develop a more internal response, this is unfortunately not so easy in terms of giving some simple training tips or advice at the end of a video. If you would like a more in-depth look at how we train internally, let me know in the comments section below. I might be able to give a broad brushstrokes structure, if you like, outlining some of the main principles. Well, I hope that gives you some background to the 3 overarching principles that govern response training in traditional martial arts: physical, mental, and internal. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, consider leaving a like and a comment, and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. Also, leave your suggestions for future videos. I do read them, I do read all the comments, and I do consider them all. Thanks, cheers, and I'll see you next time.